Tenants and advocates say that landlords should have no problem making a profit under a rent control system, but the truth is, more than 70% of landlords defer maintenance when they're under rent control. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the real problems that landlords face when they're under this rent control system. Obviously, a lot of people they do not understand the basics of why landlords they suffer so badly. Not just landlords, but tenants as well. Okay, rent control destroys new development, destroys it, makes it so that it is just very difficult for developers to come in there and build anything new. It also makes it so landlords they can't make a profit, or at least not make as much of a profit as before. And what does that lead to? That leads to those landlords deferring maintenance in order to make the pay their expenses. Okay, I mean cover their expenses. So yeah, I mean it's a bad situation. It's a bad situation, and a lot of landlords are getting out of the landlord business when they are in this sort of system, which leads to less housing available for tenants. The only people that are truly benefiting from rent control are the few tenants who are lucky enough to get one of those rent control units and lock it in and hope they just stay there forever in a lot of cases. So it's an absolutely ridiculous situation. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think, okay? What are some of the worst aspects that you can think of rent control? Now, yeah, we cover a lot of this stuff, over and over again. And they say, oh, well, these talking points are the same no matter what. Like, yeah, that's because they're all true. And in all the rent control systems that I've seen, you see aspects of it this. So, it needs to be repeated. I don't think enough people actually know just how bad rent control is and why this sort of policy just does not work. So that's why I keep bringing this thing up. So let's get into this article. This article is coming from wealthmanagement.com, and it says rent control won't make housing more affordable. And there's so much truth in that line right there. Rent control doesn't make housing more affordable. It doesn't actually help those people who need affordable housing. That's the funny thing about it. At IREM, we recognize the importance of housing choice and access to quality housing that is affordable. We've seen how rent control undermines both of those things, making it financially challenging for property owners and real estate managers to meet the needs of their tenants. No question, there's a housing shortage across the U.S., and housing prices are soaring. To combat this, several states and municipalities have proposed rent control measures to make housing more affordable. But as we've seen, rent control doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Some of the common sense arguments against rent control include the following economic and social factors. It reduces the quantity of existing available housing. People are less likely to move if rents are controlled, which also results in even fewer opportunities for new tenants to secure housing. And that's a good point right there, okay? If you look at places like New York and San Francisco where rent control policies are in place right now, they have people living in their units for 20, 30, 40 years, okay? You know how ridiculous that is? I mean, really, think about that for a moment. Now, turnover in a regular apartment is every couple of years. It isn't 40 years. People don't stay in apartments that long unless they have a large incentive to stay there. And the rents being artificially subsidized and the prices being restricted by the government, that is a very good reason to stay in an apartment. So let's say you get a San Francisco apartment under rent control. Well, why would you ever leave? You wouldn't. Okay, you could sublet it out and make a huge profit off of it, or you could just live super cheap and never have to worry about making a rent payment ever again. So yeah, the people they don't move, and this creates a huge problem because people who want to move in, well, none of those rent control units are available to them. So, like I said, this only benefits the people who are lucky enough to have the unit. So, if there's less turnover, and you want new people to move into the community, they're not going to be able to get a rent control unit. It subsidizes residents who don't need it. A recent study by the National Apartment Association showed that nearly 60% of housing providers are directly aware of higher income tenants who benefit from rent control. This counters the misunderstanding held by half of Americans that rent control is meant to primarily provide housing assistance to moderate to lower income families. Yeah, and one of the hugest flaws with rent control is it's not means tested, which means that you could have somebody, let's say you're a doctor who makes $500,000 a year, right? And you can live in a rent controlled unit. Does that make any sense to you? You have a person who has a super high income, has no problem paying their bills, and they're receiving the same rental subsidies as people who are struggling to get by and lower income. That's dumb. Okay, it is so dumb. And it makes no logical sense whatsoever. And you know what? This is part of the huge flaw with rent control. If they wanted to implement a rent control policy, why wouldn't you just implement it for people under a certain income threshold? Okay. I'm not saying that rent control is a good idea, but when you throw out this whole thing where, oh, well, everybody can get rent control, the only thing it does is it largely benefits these upper income people who don't need it. It reduces the quality of available housing. With a limit set on rental income and increasing operating costs, margins shrink for building owners. This forces them to absorb the expense of essential maintenance and makes it more challenging to invest in property improvements. NAA's research shows that 67% of housing providers have deferred or expect to defer non essential maintenance and improvements due to rent control. Yeah, 67%, nearly 70% of landlords who own rent control properties are deferring maintenance and improvements. So, like one of the things I remember seeing was there was this article in New York, right, in New York City. And there was this person, and I believe they were paying like something like $300 a month to live in this like Upper West Side Manhattan apartment. And this person had lived there for like 30 or 40 years, just some unbelievably long amount of time, right? And the person passed away. So they go up into the unit afterwards, and this place was ancient. I mean, not only was it ancient, but it was falling apart on the inside. It looked horrible. It looked awful. It was an absolutely awful mess. Yet the person stayed in there because it was under rent control and they were essentially getting the place for free. Imagine in the year 2023 paying $300 a month to live in the Upper West Side of New York, right? Are you ever going to want to move out of that place? No. I mean, you could sublet it even and make a fortune. So, obviously this person didn't want to leave and they lived the entirety of their life right there. And the question I always have is, did the person actually need the rent control? How much income did this person make? And by that person staying in that unit, did that prevent somebody who truly was lower income from being able to live there? You know what I mean? So, like, imagine like you have this Upper West Side apartment and it's being rented for $300 a month, right? And you're like, oh well, this person only made 100,000 a year and they got this place for 300 a month. But there was somebody down the street who made 30 grand a year and they don't have a place for 300 a month. They have to pay market rents because this 100 grand a year person over here was staying inside that place for so long. So yeah, I mean, there's so many issues with rent control, and I'm going to go over this last one that they list in this article. It limits new construction. In areas with rent control, there's less incentive for property development. The developers surveyed in the NAA's research said they avoid investment in locations where rent control is in place. Many developers prefer to build in areas where they can respond to local economic factors and control their own rents. And when the cost to build is already so high and the new construction process is so complex, it becomes less attractive for builders to construct new housing for moderate or low income families where rent is controlled. And that is a good point, right? Now, a lot of these places, what they'll do is they'll put a policy in place that says, oh, well, if the building is under 10 or 15 years old, they don't have to comply with rent control, right? Here's the problem with that. First of all, the number of developers who want to build in a place where they have these limits on, how many years you can be without rent control is far fewer than the number of developers who want to build in places with no rent control. So let's say that 10% of all the developers want to build in a place, even with that policy, right? So you have far fewer developers. But those developers who do want to build there, they know they have to maximize their profits as much as possible. They know this. So what do? They build luxury. They build very high end stuff that rents for way, way more than what people in general can afford because that is the only way that they're going to be able to make the numbers work. So you end up with a place like New York that has just tons of new luxury development being built, but almost no affordable, even, not even, I'm not even talking about like poor people, stuff built for the super low income. I'm talking about you have almost nothing built for the middle class. That's how ridiculous it is there. So, yeah, I mean, rent control can destroy a city, destroy the development in a city, make it so that, being a landlord is unprofitable, being a real estate developer is unprofitable, so that the tenants, they can't afford the rents because, they can't even get a rent control place, and it's a disastrous policy, and I'll never stop fighting against it.